Chapter 1 of Red Hot Ice by Frank Kane. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. Red Hot Ice by Frank Kane. Chapter 1. The big DC-4 taxied gracefully into position on a side runway. A group of formally dressed people, chattering cheerfully, headed for the landing ramp. As they flashed their landing passes for the smartly uniformed hostess, she checked the pass against a typewritten list and smiled them aboard. Inside the plane, the passengers were welcomed by a tall man in a tuxedo. He greeted each arrival by name and assigned them all to seats. Muggsy Keeley of the dispatch stepped into the plane and looked around. The man in the tuxedo permitted a brief frown to mar the placidity of his forehead as he recognized her. It was quickly washed away by a smile as he extended his hand.
"Hello, Miss Keeley. I hope it's a pleasure trip."
Lou Dongan's voice was soft, suave, and showed signs of a determined attempt at culture. His graying hair was thick, wavy. He affected a thin, contrastingly dark mustache. When he smiled, dimples plowed white furrows in the mahogany tan of his cheeks.
"We're not looking for any publicity, you know."
Muggsy grinned.
"Just a tourist, Lou. I heard about your new enterprise, and I wangled me an invitation. It sounds like a new kick, and I wanted to see firsthand."
Dongan led the red-headed reporter to a seat behind the wing and hovered over her while she settled down.
"Real top-drawer crowd, isn't it, Miss Keeley?"
He looked around approvingly.
"It really draws."
The redhead studied her fellow passengers, but failed to be impressed.
"What time do we take off?"
Dongan checked the watch on his wrist.
"Shouldn't be long now."
His eyes jumped from seat to seat.
"Looks like there's just about one more carful due."
Muggsy turned, looking out the small window at her side.
"This is probably it now."
Dongan bent over, peering through the window. Suddenly he growled softly under his breath, snapped his finger. A uniformed stewardess materialized at his elbow. She was pert and blonde. The uniform coat seemed to be having difficulty containing her figure.
"Who okayed Lori Lane, Midge?"
Dongan jabbed a manicured finger in the direction of a tall blonde heading for the plane.
"I don't know, Mr. Dongan."
The stewardess tugged the typewritten list from her breast pocket, studied it.
"I don't see her name on the list. Should I tell Doris to keep her off?"
Dongan lifted the list from between the girl's fingers, ran his index finger down its length, underscored a name with his nail.
"No, she's with Al Murphy."
He handed back the list.
"Pass the word along. We don't want any more of these and party reservations. I want to know the name of everybody coming aboard in advance."
The stewardess nodded and withdrew. Muggsy studied the blonde as she approached the ramp.
"You really do rate Lou. Lori Lane, First Lady of the stage, no less."
"I need her like a hole in the head," the white-haired man growled. "That dame's strictly poison." He yanked a cigar from his breast pocket, bit off the end, and spat it in the aisle. "She's been trying to drink herself to death ever since that gigolo she's married to walked out on her. Always manages to get herself lushed up and starts trouble." He chewed morosely on the cigar, while watching the blonde and her party come aboard and find seats. When the latecomers were seated, the hostess entered and closed the door behind her. The motors on either side of the plane roared into life, and the lights above the door to the pilot's cabin urged, "No smoking, please. Fasten seatbelts." Dongan dropped into the aisle seat beside Muggsy and leaned back against the headrest as the motors reached for a new high and pitch. Slowly the big plane taxied into the main runway, waited for a clearance, then thundered to a takeoff. Dongan clenched his fists on the arms of the seat. The unlit cigar was still crushed between his teeth. "I must have flown 1,000,000 miles," he groaned. "But every time on the takeoff it's like the first time." A thin film of perspiration glistened on his forehead.
"Butterflies?"
The redhead grinned. "More like bats tonight." The plane gained altitude, headed out over the Atlantic. After a time, the shoreline started to recede behind them. Muggsy turned her attention from the window to the man beside her.
"When does the action start?"
Dongan was swabbing at his face with a balled-up handkerchief. 10 or 15 minutes, as soon as we get set up." A red light flickered to the right of the pilot's cabin, and the hostess and stewardess reappeared. There had been a slight change in costume. Now, instead of these severely tailored uniforms, the girls wore tights and peasant blouses that emphasized the fact that both had assets that stacked up with the First National Bank. And when they walked, judging by the sway, they were just as liquid. They were followed by 2 men in tuxedos. At a signal, the passengers on the opposite side of the plane stood up, and the men went to work tearing down the seats on that side and stacking them in the rear. When that was finished, one of the men set up a bar at the front of the plane while his companion busied himself assembling a breakaway craps table.
"Now I've seen everything," Muggsy grinned. "This is really a floating crap game."
Dongan pulled the cigar from between his teeth and rolled it in between thumb and forefinger.
"It cuts down the risk that took most of the profit from the old game. We don't need any stick-up insurance here, and the Vice Squad would have to grow wings to crash this place for a raid." "They could be waiting for you when you set down."
"Where?" Dongan's lips peeled back from a perfect set of teeth.
"Only 2 people know where she's going to set down. Even the pilot doesn't know whether it's LaGuardia, Idlewild, or Newark until my partner Mike Davy gives him his instructions on the way in."
The stick man took his place at the head of the table, while the passengers started flocking toward it.
"Seems a little expensive to me," Muggsy commented. "Does it pay to be so elaborate?"
Dongan replaced the cigar, chewed on it.
"For quotes?"
The redhead shook her head.
"Just curious."
"Sure, it's expensive. Everything's expensive today, ain't that right?
It's all relative."
He considered for a moment.
"Take a setup in town. First, you gotta get the okay to run. That means ice, Miss Keeley. Plenty of ice from the inspector, right down to the man on the beat. Last place Mike and me ran on the east side cost me $1,000 a week just for the okay. Here, I don't need any okay. I saved that $1,000. I had to have 2 floormen at $40 per night, 2 lookouts at $30 a night. I had to have the luggers pull them in, outside men to check for plants and stiffs. I had to have a doorman I could trust. All that costs. My nut in that place was over $6,000 a week before I opened the door." "You don't get planes for free either."
Dongan shrugged.
"Here we gross 10 times as much as in the old place. Besides, we know who's coming on board, and we can pick and choose. We keep it down to about 25, 30 players, and we have a $2,000 minimum. That's a $60,000 a night play, and that ain't 10.
A worried frown creased his forehead as his eyes followed the blonde actress on her way to the bar.
"It starts already. We're not out 20 minutes, and already that Lane dame hits the bar."
Muggsy watched the blonde as she passed the craps table, walking over to the bar. Lori Lane was tall. Her thick blonde hair was piled on top of her head. She looked about 28 from where the redhead sat and appeared to have been sewn into the skin-tight white gown. In rapid succession, she downed 2 straight shots before the bartender caught Dongan's cutoff signal. The blonde pushed the glass across the bar for a refill. When the bartender shook his head, she started to argue. The bartender leaned over, told her something in a low voice, shrugged his shoulders in response to her snapped reply. Her full lips were a thin, angry line as she left the bar and shouldered her way to a spot at the table.
"Nothing but trouble, that dame,"
Dongan growled. He chewed on his cigar, ground the end into a soggy mass, dropped it to the floor.
"Look around. Play if you want. We'll forget the minimum in your case. I've got to get to work."
He pulled himself out of his seat, walked over to the blonde hostess, and pointed to where Muggsy was sitting. In a moment, the hostess was over with a drink.
"Mr. Dongan thought you'd like some refreshments."
Muggsy smiled her thanks.
"I guess a flight like this is different from your usual run."
The hostess shook her head.
"I'd never flown before I went to work for Mr. Dongan. I was in the chorus of the Gaieties. This sounded like a lot more fun, so I took the job."
She looked up at a snap of the bartender's fingers.
"Pardon me, Miss Keeley. Somebody at the table wants a drink."
Muggsy got up from her seat and walked over to the table. She stood watching the play for a moment. Lori Lane was playing recklessly, taking it or laying it on every roll. From close up, she was a few years older than she'd appeared in the dim light at the bar. The bright table lights mercilessly revealed the fine network of lines under her eyes and the losing fight her makeup was waging with crow's feet. Under the heavily painted outline, her lips drooped at the corners. When the pile of chips in front of her had dwindled to nothing, the blonde pushed her way to the bar. She ordered a straight bourbon and gave the bartender an argument when he tried to talk her out of it. Finally, at a signal from Dongan, he filled her glass. She tossed it off and returned to the table. 3 times during the 6-hour flight, the pile of chips in front of her disappeared. On her last visit to the bar, she was met with a firm headshake from Lou Dongan. Muggsy could hear her voice complaining above the roar of the motors and the monotonous chant of, "If you don't bet, you can't win. If you don't speculate, you can't accumulate," by the stickman. The blonde's voice was becoming strident, shrill. The players paid no attention to the byplay, huddled over the table anxious to complete their play before the plane started back in. The winners were feverishly determined to pyramid their winnings into a killing, the losers convinced that, with enough time, they could recoup their losses. Dongan turned his back on the blonde and walked over to a tall, good-looking man huddled over the craps table. He whispered in the man's ear, nodding toward the blonde. The big man walked over to Lori Lane, caught her by the arm, and propelled her toward the restroom in the rear. "'Tain't to the eyeballs and into us for better than 10 grand, he growled to Muggsy. "I wouldn't take Al Murphy's job of handling that witch if the vigorish was 50%. Muggsy raised her eyebrows. "The which?" "Vigorish, the house percentage. An agent takes a 10% commission. The house in a layout like this takes 5%. It's called the vigorish. Don't ask me why." "Live and learn, I always say. With a 5% cut and a minimum play of 60,000 a night, I can see." Muggsy was cut off by the sound of scuffling from the rear of the plane. The tall man was trying to restrain the blonde, seemed to be urging her back into the restroom. "There she goes again," Dongan growled. "She must have had her own bottle with her. Excuse me." His eyes flagged down the bartender. He led the way to the rear where Murphy was struggling with the blonde. "Get your hands off me, Murph," she snarled. "A fine agent you are. You let a tin-horn crook take me." She struggled vainly to dislodge his hand from her arm. "Leave her alone, Al," Dongan told him as he walked up. The agent nodded, dropped his hand from the girl's arm. "Just like that," the blonde sneered. "The tin-horn gives orders and you jump. Just a lousy tin-horn crook and you jump." "Shut up and behave, Laurie," Murph urged. He tried to push her into a seat. "I didn't know she had a jug with her, Lou. I'll take care of her." The blonde pushed off his hands. "Go ahead and crawl, if that crook thinks I'm paying off a rigged game." "You keep making with that mouth of yours, and I'll fix it so it's shut for a long time," Dongan told her in a low, hard voice. "You think the game's crooked? That's your privilege. You came here. We didn't send for you. But don't get any ideas about welshing, baby. You wouldn't live long enough for the money to do you any good." Lori Lane pushed past her agent, swung at the gambler's face, missed. "Try and get it." Dongan reached out, buried his hand in her hair, pulled her face close to his. His voice was low, the suavity peeled off of it. "Don't ever try that again, Lush. Nobody lifts a hand to Lou Dongan and walks away from it." The blonde started to say something, reconsidered. She licked at her lips, dropped her eyes from his. Dongan pushed her back into a seat. "Just put your money where your mouth is." He turned to Murphy, jabbed a finger into the big man's chest. "Don't ever bring her into any place of mine again. Leave her here and you come up and settle her tab." "I haven't got enough money to settle the tab," the blonde told him defiantly. "Ask Murph, I'm nearly broke." Dongan's eyes were cold, hard. He fixed them on Murphy. "I don't care how broke either one of you are. You brought her, Murph, and I'm holding you responsible for the payoff." The tall man looked worried. "Will you take an IOU? I'll raise it for her. She has some stuff I can turn into cash if you give me a week." Dongan scowled. "Okay, a week. Do us both a favor and get the dough to me by then." He nodded down to the girl. "Take that jug away from her and strap her in that seat. I've taken all the grief I'm going to take from her tonight or any other night." End of chapter 1.